The Void, Series 1, Episode 2. Who the Hell is Buck Rogers? Chapter 1. For a while now, Carter Vincent had known that his life was over. Ever since the diagnosis, he'd known his fate was inevitable. He took some pride in the fact that he'd outlived the doctor's estimates, but now he was too weak to fight it any longer. His body was succumbing to the disease, and as he lay in that hospital bed, he felt nothing but exhaustion and nausea. Carter struggled to fix his attention on his surroundings. He knew where he was, but it was difficult to discern the time of day, or even what day it was. He had a watch somewhere, and he tried to remember where he put it, but he couldn't quite recall where. He opened his eyes and tried to focus on the people around him. It took a while, but he recognized his wife Karen and smiled weakly at her. He could see the sadness in her eyes as she reached out and grasped his hand. The warmth of her hand felt good, a tactile pleasure that he missed in her absence. Two children stood mournfully at her side. The younger one was crying freely, whilst the older one tried his best to stifle his distress. Jacob was on the verge of being a teenager, whilst Elizabeth was a few years younger. Carter could feel the love swell within him, but it was accompanied with despair, for he hated to see them like this, and it tore at his being. Carter had lost his mother when he was young, her life curtailed by a drunk driver, and he knew the pain of growing up without a parent, and now he was inflicting the same pain on his own children. He fought as hard as he can to be with them, but now he was spent. "I'm sorry, kids," he apologized, wheezing. "I'm sorry I'm not going to be there for you." The words came out spontaneously, and in part inspired by his own confusion, his foggy mind clouding his ability to consider what he wanted to say. "Jacob, you're the man in the house now," Carter added. "Look after Liz and your mum for me." Jacob stood in silence, too choked up to reply. He tried to vocalize, but all he could manage were the beginnings of a few words. Elizabeth walked up to his bedside and threw her arms around him. "Don't go, Daddy." "I don't think it's up to me, little fishy," he replied, coining a pet name. She'd had a fascination for fish as a toddler, and the name evolved from there. "It's just my time. I wish I could stay with you, but unfortunately, life's just not fair like that." Elizabeth sobbed uncontrollably into his chest. He could feel the vibrations of each sob and the gulp of breath she made, and he felt oddly soothed by it. He couldn't quite explain why, but her very presence just made him feel at peace. "Don't grieve for me, little fishy. Remember the good times we've had together," he stated, stroking her hair with his free hand. "Remember the holidays and the parties and the trips to the museum." "It won't be the same without you, Dad," she wailed. "No, it won't. But you'll have to make your own way now. You might not think so now, but you'll have plenty of good times to come. Life is nothing if not change," Carter philosophized. "Just stay away from the boys." Elizabeth chuckled slightly, and it was a reaction that filled him with delight. "And if they mess with you in any way, I'll come back and zombify them." Elizabeth chuckled again. "Too far, Carter," Karen admonished. "Just having a little fun." "It's not the fun that's the problem. It's your sense of humor. I seem to recall that's what attracted you to me in the first place. Only you can make jokes about zombies on their deathbed." Karen smiled, the tears welling up again. "I think I'm a little past caring about social convention now." Carter followed his punchline with a coughing fit that racked his body. The pain in his chest returned, stinging him with savage intent. As the cough subsided, he did his best to conceal the pain, not wanting to upset his family further. "Is Reese coming in today?" Carter asked as a means of deflection. It didn't seem to work on Karen, who was concerned with his little fit. Still, she did answer. Reese was his best friend and a fellow pioneer on the seas of high finance. "He should be coming in about an hour." "Good. Hope he brings beer. I'm fed up with water." "You know you shouldn't. Not on the painkillers." "What harm's it going to do now?" "If it staves away your death for just 5 minutes, I'll take it," Karen countered. Carter smiled at his wife with adoration. She was so beautiful, so compassionate, and he was so undeserving of her. You know there's another option. She leaned in close to him and whispered. I don't want to have this conversation again, Carter responded. I love you, but I don't want you squandering a fortune on something so experimental. He checked his words. He wanted to say lunatic, but it would only offend her. Karen was desperate to save him. She clung on to any hope, no matter how fringe it was. Save it for the kids. I'd rather have them have the best start in life than have you all destitute for some false hope. It's not experimental, Carter. They've had some success. And lots of failure, he shot back. To say it's a long shot is putting it mildly. I'd face the devil himself to have you with me, Karen determined. God, you're so beautiful when you off, Carter laughed. I think you... The coughing started again, and this time the pain increased dramatically. He spasmed uncontrollably and could taste... He felt Jacob's strong hand grab his arm in an attempt to restrain him. The cries of his family echoed in his ears as he coughed harder and harder. He slumped back onto the mattress, and the world started to fade around him. He could hear commotion around him, but it was muffled and incoherent. Then the world went black. But into this blackness came a little light. Noise was heard again, but it was still muffled and incoherent. The light became a blur that slowly started to come into focus. Had he lost consciousness? How long had he been out for? Carter knew from previous surgery how discombobulating the whole awakening from anesthesia could be, and this seemed eerily familiar. One thing was different, though. This time, his eyes hurt. Not the overwhelming pain he felt a moment ago, but a dull pain, not unlike toothache. He moved them slightly and the pain fled. As his sight returned, he could see he was in a different hospital ward. His family weren't there, but there were doctors. A middle-aged Asian woman leaned over him, checking his pupils. She started talking to him, but the language was unfamiliar. It didn't sound familiar in any way, but he'd not had much experience with Asian languages, so he couldn't describe himself to be an expert on the matter. Another doctor came into his view, conversing with the other doctor in the same ersatz language. He wondered where he was. He wondered if he was in the same hospital. Hell, he wondered if he was still in Britain. He tried to take in his surroundings. The ward was much nicer than the one he'd been in, less white and antiseptic, more beige and floral. If you took away the medical equipment, it could seem more like a hotel than a hospital. The doctors noticed his movements and spoke to him. He had no idea what they were saying to him, but if he had to guess, they were telling him not to move or something similar. In all the flurry of words, one word he managed to pick out, not because it was known to him, but it didn't seem to fit with the doctor's lip movements, like a badly dubbed film. That word, babble. What it meant he couldn't guess, but he wondered why he heard a different word to what was spoken. He became a bit more aware of his body and found it feeling better than before. He still felt groggy, but the pain in his chest had gone and the nausea had faded. He did feel cold, though, as though he had been outside on a cold winter's day with no clothes on. Had he been in surgery? With the absence of the chest pain, he wondered if they had managed to cure him. He shouldn't hope, not with his terminal condition. And yet, that hope still lingered. "Where's my family?" Carter croaked with an extremely hoarse voice. The male doctor talked to him in a soothing voice, offering him a glass of water. He took a gentle sip, and it felt like a monsoon flood racing down a dusty canyon. He'd no idea how dehydrated he'd become. The doctor took the glass away and spoke again. He heard that word again, babble. But then he got a second word, doctor. Again, it was out of sync with his lips and seemed weirdly disconnected. The word came at the same time the doctor was indicating himself. It dawned on him that the doctor was introducing himself. There were two words that followed that he presumed must be the doctor's name. Denham Richt. It was not a name he was familiar with, or one he had ever heard before in his life in any combination, but it was still a name, and now he had an identity for one of those people treating him. "Do you know where my family is?" Carter reiterated. The doctor paused for a moment and started conversing with the other doctor again. From their expressions, they were as perplexed by his speech as he was with theirs. A third person came into view at the end of his bed, this time a young woman in some kind of uniform. It wasn't a uniform he identified as a medical one, but it was simple and minimalist. Maybe she was a nurse, but her stance didn't seem like a nurse's. She held herself confidently, and the doctor seemed to defer to her, as though she was a superior authority. Maybe a consultant, then. Again, he was assaulted by a barrage of gobbledygook, as all three talked amongst themselves. Waves and waves of it crashed onto the shores of his ears, and his frustration built up. "Would someone just speak some English, please?" This seemed to elicit an interesting response, as they seemed to recognize something he said. One of the doctors seemed to talk to someone who wasn't there, and then a voice returned from nowhere. It was still nonsense, but he heard the word English. "Can understand," Dr. Denham Richt announced, the sentence interspersed with unfamiliar words, but now sounding a lot more like English. To add to the weirdness, every one of the spoken English words seemed dubbed. "I understand that a bit. Babble, starting to work." "What's babble?" The Asian doctor tapped her ear. "Device, translate, head." He tried to understand what the doctor was trying to say, but he could only get the vaguest meaning from it. He now understood something was translating for him, but what it was, or whether it was going to get any better, was a mystery to him. "Could someone just tell me where my family is?" This seemed to be understood, and the three attending physicians started talking amongst themselves. He understood the odd word and heard family spoken several times. They all looked rather concerned, as though they were considering what to tell him. He could infer from this that there was something onerous coming, but what it was, he had no idea. It was then he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Something he had considered a piece of medical equipment started whistling and pulsating. The movement looked less like a device and more organic. It then started to move, rotating around its axis on three legs he only just noticed. It spun around as it moved forward and into another room. "What in the holy was that?" He had to be hallucinating. Maybe the anesthetic, along with whatever surgery they had performed, had some unintended side effects. Medical equipment did not get up and walk. With the absence of his family and the sudden hallucination, he was becoming increasingly agitated. There was something deeply wrong here, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. He tried moving his arms, but found that they were heavier than he ever thought possible. It took all his effort just to move his hand, twitching his fingers and rotating his wrist. For a moment, he feared he was paralyzed, but then his rational mind posited that he wouldn't be able to move his hand at all if he were. He tried moving his legs. There was some movement there, but not much. He felt his knee pop as it moved, that familiar sensation he felt if he'd been inactive too long. It wasn't painful, but it was disconcerting. He tried to swing his leg over the side of the bed, but he could only do it by small increments. Noticing his attempts to get out of the bed, the two doctors sought to placate his restlessness, but their jabberwocky only served to agitate him further. He could make out the word rest, but that was it. "Karen!" he hoarsely gasped. One of the doctors placed a small tube on his arm. He first thought it was an injection, but there was no penetration of the skin, no intrusive object to deliver a drug. However, he did suddenly feel very drowsy, and for the second time in a short period, he found darkness swallowing him up.